All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Got chapter 27, section 2, social changes. So last section, 27-1, talked about how things were changing in terms of technology and how things were changing in terms of the economy. Here we're looking a little bit more at society. Whenever you see the word social, think the word society. And that is kind of how the experiences of everyday people change. And one thing that was especially true in this time period was the level of migrations that were taking place. When we look at migrations, no matter where or really when, we can kind of look at it in two ways. One is to say, well, what are the factors that are causing people to leave? And sometimes we'll identify these as push factors. Your book doesn't use this term, but it gives some examples of this. So we might say a push factor is a reason for someone to leave, right? You know, one step in migrating is to leave where you're originally from. And some examples that are included here are the Irish potato famine, which of course occurred in Ireland, where the potatoes didn't grow for that particular year. A lot of people starved to death. A lot of people moved. 1 million Irish people moved to the United States. In places like Russia and Eastern Europe, persecution of certain minority populations like the Jews caused them to go to other areas, also the United States. And then just general poverty in parts of the world could cause one family to move from one area or another. So these would all be reasons why people would pack their bags. But there's another side of it, and that is pull, and that is reasons for choosing a particular destination. So for example, the Irish potato famine would cause people to leave Ireland, but what would make them travel to the US, right? And so when we look here, we say, okay, well, it'd be reasons like economic opportunities. This was true not just in the United States, but this was true for other places as well. South America, there was economic opportunities. And also cheap transportation, right? So for a very long time, as bad as things might be in one particular part of the world, a limiting factor on immigration is the cost of transport. But of course, with very developed railroad networks, with steamships, right, with the number of ships and the size of ships increasing tenfold between the years of 1850 and 1900, it just became simply a lot cheaper for people to move. And so all of these reasons, I would probably especially highlight these reasons as being new, right, especially the transportation part, is reason to why this time period is a time period of where you have one of the most intense periods of global migrations, really ever, right, between 1850 and 1900. Now, this also facilitated the continued problems in urban environments. If you're not familiar, urban just means city. And in 1851, Great Britain became the first first majority urban country, meaning in 1851, more people in Great Britain lived in the city than they did in the countryside, and we would call that rural. So rural is kind of the country, we'll call it countryside. Urban equals the city. And that was, of course, because Great Britain was the first nation to industrialize, but as that process went beyond Great Britain's borders to places like the United States, to Germany and France, I know at least in the case of the United States in the 1920s, the United States became a majority urban nation, more people living in cities than they did in the countryside. Now, a lot of the early industrial cities experienced a lot of problems with overcrowding and pollution and disease. But over time, urban improvements made city life not just livable, but in some cases desirable. These urban improvements led to a drop in death rates. And what sort of improvements are we referring to? Well, sewage systems, right, plumbing, electric lighting made cities much more safe, especially at night. Police and fire municipalities that could, of course, deal with crime and fires that could occur, and garbage removal, which of course would be something that would help with sanitation. Future cities, or at least cities that, one of the things about industrialization is that it was very much a sort of ad hoc process. It just sort of happened. Nobody prepared or planned for it. And that's why some of the earliest industrial cities like London, like Manchester, like Liverpool, they were pretty catastrophic, even Paris, right? But once the process of industrialization took place, cities were able to better prepare themselves for the type of population and the type of needs that people needed. And so urban planning was a way to centrally plan cities to account for things like, traffic, to account for things like building codes. So for example, a lot of the newer cities divided up their cities into residential, in which areas where people would live, commercial, which would be businesses, and, industrial. That way, for example, there wasn't people's homes right next to like a steel plant or a slaughterhouse or something like that, whereas in the early industrial cities, that was not the case. You saw this especially in some cities in South America. Even if you look at some of these centrally planned cities today, Paris was one where they had to tear up a lot of the old city and plan it in a way to make sure that, all sort of the streets are in a grid-like fashion, or at least some sort of centrally planned way. So a lot of the newer industrial cities, Chicago in Illinois is a good example. You can tell they're you can tell that they're urban planning because of the way that sort of the cities or the streets are sort of set up. The industrial period also had its effect on culture and gender. So for example, the technologies of the Industrial Revolution led to the rise of a middle class, but also a specific culture relating to that middle class. This was felt most intensely in Great Britain during the Victorian Age. So this is a period in Great Britain. It's named for the British Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837, or actually I don't know exactly if this is the dates that she ruled, but this is generally considered when the Victorian Age is. And it's characterized by a culture related to family and gender. And when we mean gender, we mean the role that both men and women play in society. And in this middle class culture of Great Britain, the idea of the roles men and women should play was characterized by what's known as separate spheres. So this is the roles men and women should play. And as you can kind of guess from the term here, it is indeed separate. This is something that affected the upper and middle class exclusively. And more or less what it came down to was that the role that men should play should be in the public sphere, and the role that women should be is in the private or domestic sphere. And this was something that was reinforced not just by culture, but also by law. It was something that was, again, very sort of intense in the upper and middle class. And you can see kind of an image of it here, right? The depiction of women in upper and middle class Great Britain during the late industrial period, and then sort of the depiction of men in the public arena. This was not, a social system that served everybody equally. In fact, a number of women, suffragettes, or the suffragists, I should say, protested against this sort of system, this culture, this society, this legal code. The suffragists were women who advocated the right to vote. When we think of the public arena, this would include things like the right to vote. This would be to hold public office. And not just in Great Britain, but pretty much in all industrial nations, women were excluded from these processes. And so there was an emerging group of women who continued to speak out against this and advocated for the right to vote. Here there's a suffragette. Suffragette is a suffragist. It's just a term for a person who is that, or maybe that's just a specific American term, but Here is a suffragist being arrested by the police for breaking the law. For working class women, this idea of separate spheres didn't really apply as much. There certainly was still a gendered division of labor. So, for example, for working class women, being at home was not you could say a luxury that was provided for them. In working class families, men, women, and children all had to work. But the work that was required was still very much gendered. So, for example, women worked almost exclusively in textile industries or as domestic servants, whereas men would typically be involved in mining or steel production or other sorts of factory work that was considered to be masculine. So we might say here, we'll just say a gendered division of labor. And this was also reinforced by law. So, for example, some of the very first protective legislation specifically protected women from certain industries, mining, for example. So something like protective legislation would be, women were not allowed to work in certain industries. Now, while this may have served the initial purpose of getting women out of potentially dangerous jobs, what it really did in the long run was just reinforce this notion that, men and women's work ought to be sort of different.